I thought I'd start by sharing a quote from Marilyn Frye. Marilyn Frye was a feminist. She was writing about 40 years ago. And in this quote, she's comparing systemic oppression to a bird living in a bird cage. And she says, if you look very closely at just one wire in the cage, you cannot see the other wires. It is only when you step back, stop looking at the wires one by one microscopically, and take a macroscopic view of the whole cage that you can see why the bird does not go anywhere. And then you will see it in a moment. The bird is surrounded by a network of systematically related barriers, no one of which could be the least hindrance to its flight, but which by their relations to each other are as confining as the walls of a dungeon. We say this again. The bird is surrounded by a network of systematically related barriers, no one of which would be the least hindrance to its flight, but which by their relations to each other are as confining as the walls of a dungeon. Now, I like this quote for many reasons, but principally, I think it's helpful in this world of systems change and systems barriers to try to get your arms around it and really feel what it's about. And I think this is just one way of actually characterizing in what, I think is a fairly visceral way what systemic oppression is all about. So we're gonna, let's see. So we're gonna return to the 6 conditions for the first part of our conversation today. And just so you know, I see the 6 conditions as really bars in a bird cage. Now others might interpret it differently, and I'm not sure that's what Marilyn was talking about. But for me, these are barriers, and they can be enhancers to thinking about systems change. And for those of you that were with us last time, this will be a little bit of a review, but I'll just move really quickly through it, particularly for those of you that are newer. We think about 6 conditions of six conditions of systems change at 3 different levels, principally based on their visibility. So at sort of the high level, there's the structural change, there's policies, practices, and resource flows. Those are explicit. You can see those, you can research those. And then one level below that are semi-explicit, sometimes seen, sometimes not seen conditions, relationships and connections, and power dynamics. And the deepest condition in terms of systems change are mental models, the basic sort of beliefs and values, orientations that we have as individuals and as a culture that can impede change. They can also help change along. We call this level transformative because it's the deepest level, and typically if we can shift mental models, that opens up the opportunity to shift things at the second level and the first level. Now, one of the things I said last time was that when you think about long-term sustainable change, it's not possible unless you pay sufficient attention to the second and third levels. What I call the relational level, power dynamics, relationships and connections, and mental models. But often, particularly in the formalized segment of the social sector, NGOs, philanthropy, government, the orientation around systems change is at that top level, that structural level. And I can give you countless examples, I'm sure you can provide your own as well, of times when entities and people and organizations were focused on changing that top level, but didn't provide enough attention to the second and the third levels. One of the things also, when I think about this picture, I often say that when we think about systems change, really some of the most compelling examples over the last several hundred years come from movements. And movements tend to enter into systems change from sort of the bottom left, if you will, around relationships and connections and mental models and power dynamics, moving up into very specific goals that they may have around policies, practices, and resource flows. The other key point I'd make with this is that there's interdependence between all these conditions. You really can't look at them in a silo. And to truly shift a system, you've got to consider thinking about this from a holistic standpoint. So what I wanted to do was to begin today by sharing 2 examples of what it looks like to consider shifting a system holistically. We're going to start with an example in the United States, and it's around same-sex marriage. I understand that Australia went through a fairly similar parallel path. But I want to begin in 1996 when President Clinton signed the Defense of Marriage Act, which was really defining marriage as the union of one man and one woman, and allowed states in the United States to refuse to recognize same-sex marriages. Now, there was a lurch away from that by 2004. Massachusetts was the first state to pass legislation that granted rights to gay and lesbian couples to marry. And unfortunately, that was a bit of a sort of aberration, if you will, from what was going on. Just 6 months after Massachusetts passed same-sex marriage, voters in 11 states approved the constitutional amendments that basically said, okay, marriage is exclusively a heterosexual institution. And in 2008, California, which is typically perceived of and is, a fairly progressive liberal bastion, voters approved what was called Proposition 8 there, banning same-sex marriage and creating a new amendment to the California Constitution, which said only marriage is between a man and a woman in the state of California. So by this time, in 2008, the Freedom to Marry movement was feeling, they were pretty much stuck. And they got together as a movement, folks that were involved in that movement, and set their goals going forward. And it was 10 plus 10 plus 10 by 20. That is that 10 states would have legal marriage, 10 states would have civil unions, and 10 would have some level of domestic partner benefits. And that would happen by 2020. And then they didn't have this model in front of them, but they actually did think very holistically in terms of thinking about each of these dimensions. So I'm just going to walk through some of the examples of what they did in each of these areas. So they did start with mental models. They learned in California where they lost, and they argued their case based on equal rights. And they tested messaging and found that equal rights was not going to convert people, but love did. So the notion that two people who are in love should have the right to marry was a compelling mental model that they began to move forward with. And they brought on board many people who were more traditional. Here you have a picture of husband and a wife who have a gay child, and are talking about how they were actually able to switch their perspectives. And this allowed other people to feel permission that they could actually move. So in the area of relationships and connections, they did sort of recast out of the first effort, or not the first effort, but the previous effort, was a lot more fractious. And they said, we've got to work in a much more aligned and coordinated way. So they literally did create a backbone and brought together organizations, gave everybody sort of a seat at the table, and also did a number of other things in terms of sort of relationships and connections. They've created a database of local champions across the country who would speak out, including everyone with marriage licenses in states that at that point allowed it. They also created pathways for new people to join in. From a power dynamic standpoint, they very much started with grassroots. Maine was one of the first states that they went into, and they had over 100 door-to-door organizations and local champions from their communities speaking at events and working to build power and identify leaders. They also used their power to sort of bring in communities that heretofore hadn't been a part of the dialogue. See from this this newspaper article, most of California's Black voters initially backed the gay marriage ban, and they knew they had to reach out to this set of players and engage Black leaders. In New York, they targeted 3 legislators for defeat and beat all of them. In Massachusetts, they put big resources behind allies to help them win. Get Equal was an organization that really put a lot of pressure from the standpoint of organizing protests. From the standpoint of resource flows, there were a number of things that they thought about. First is they secured a large long-term donor in the Gill Foundation in Colorado, who they knew would be with them through thick and thin, even through some defeats like in California. They identified well-known Republican donors who had gay children, and they worked with other allies to change how they were seen by media and the legislators in terms of information flow. I don't know if the structure exists in Australia. The PAC, the Political Action Committee, which is basically organizations that raise private money to influence legislation and election. And so they organized a number of these and supported a number of these and used them to quote unquote thank and spank elected leaders in key states. They developed playbooks when it came to rules and practices. They said, okay, we need to be ready when gay marriage is passed, and they developed playbooks and legal briefs of rules and policy changes so that when states did in fact pass gay marriage, they could immediately begin issuing marriage license. They had a dream team, won referendums in 19 states, got the President of the United States on board, and in 2015, the Supreme Court declared that gay marriage was legal in all 50 states, and this greatly exceeded the initial goals that they had. So, and this comes from colleague Paul Schmitz, I think some of you may have met, who developed these key lessons based on same-sex marriage example. One is play in every part of the system. Two is organize, don't mobilize, build collective distributed leadership. Three is you need to be both top down and bottom up linked. This is being inside the issue and also outside the issue. Fourth is creating on-ramps to engage partners and allies. And fifth is having a disciplined long-term strategy to move to results. Now, you know, I think this is a really powerful example. Some of you may be thinking, and if you're not, I'll put it out there, that, you know, this was very focused on a single policy goal, and it was a movement. It was, you know, it looks a bit different than perhaps the work that you're involved with that's more of a collective impact focus. But I'm absolutely convinced at this point that, first of all, I think long-term, there's, you know, perhaps not movements and collective impact. They ideally might become one and the same. In the short term, that may not be possible, but I think collective impact efforts can learn a lot from movements, and as can movements learn a lot from collective impact. But a really, I think, interesting example of an effort that actually did think through comprehensively using, addressing all 6 conditions of systems change. So I want to move to something that maybe feels a little bit closer to home, so to speak, because this is actually in New York City, halfway around the world. But in terms of the subject matter, so Staten Island is one of the 5 boroughs of New York City. It's about half a million people. For those who may not know about Staten Island, they have significant disparities, a lot of racial and cultural unrest. It's an interesting, it truly is an island, as you can see there. And the North Shore, they call it the North Shore, is one of the most diverse places you'll find, you know, certainly in the United States. You know, Blacks, Latinos, Caribbean, white. It's a really fascinating place. It's also unfortunately very poor. The rest of the island is pretty much, you know, middle income and white. So race has always been seen as a large issue there. In the midst of, you know, George Floyd and the many others who unfortunately have and horribly have been sort of victims of the police, there was a major sort of highly visible case of police taking the life of a young Black man called Eric Gardner there. So there's a lot of sort of intense and understandably sort of challenging dynamic on the island. At the same time, it is an island that it is a community of 500,000 people who have had, you know, some level of experience working with collective impact in a variety of areas. And what I'm going to take you through before I put this big, you know, intense slide up there, is just saying, okay, we're going to look at, they were looking broadly at K through 12 public education. We're going to take one portion of that, which is early childhood, and sort of ask ourselves, if we were to take the 6 conditions, the upside down triangle, and look at what we could do in terms of strategies against each of the 6 conditions. What would that look like? So that's what I'm going to show you. And obviously there's a lot on this slide, but you sort of break it down. From a policy standpoint, they saw a need to change the state's insurance program to allow more people to be eligible at higher income levels, not just poverty. Other practices and resource flows at that structural level, they thought about change. And then at sort of the relational level, they said, okay, relationships and connections for early childhood, pediatricians and caregivers can get together more frequently to discuss sort of what are the best ways to support child development. That's like real critical. From a power dynamics standpoint, they recognized the sort of the power imbalance, if you will, between parent and teacher, and said, okay, let's figure out how we can sort of expand the meetings there and make more accommodation for parents coming from more challenging situations. And from a mental model standpoint, they said, okay, we've got a number of, in this instance, they were looking at what they could do on the North Shore, which is a very diverse area, with principally white teachers and administrators, and saying, okay, how can we implement cultural competency training so that teachers and administrators can come to work in a way that is going to most facilitate the development of the child. So you can start to break this down, and it's never a one-to-one. This is more a little bit illustrative, that you shouldn't necessarily always be thinking about strategies for each of the conditions, but in fact, these are real strategies that Staten Island is actually moving forward with in each of these areas. And you'll find that one of the ways that I like to, I find helpful to sort of think about change in the context of thinking about these various strategies is you're going to come up with some strategies that are technical at that structural level. And then you're going to come up with strategies and develop strategies that are more at the cultural level. The technical level tends to be more quote unquote formalized expertise based. I think what I have found is that the formalized social sector folks in general will feel themselves much more comfortable with the technical dimensions of change. The cultural dimensions of change, no matter who you are, whether or not you're a practitioner, you're a leader in the community, you're somebody coming more from higher formalized authority, the cultural change it's more difficult to get your arms around. There's higher levels of unpredictability. It's usually much longer term to change. And yet the cultural conditions are the source of transformation. If you really want transformation in community, the cultural conditions, are areas that, are going to need attention. And, any issue is going to have both cultural and technical, dimensions to it. In Western colonized societies, I think, the one issue probably that underlies all others, that in and of itself, is something that, needs to be addressed, is this issue of racial equity. And it's going to have both technical dimensions to it and huge cultural dimensions to it. So I'm just going to connect this back to Staten Island for a second, and say that racial equity was dealt with in the work, not separate from the work. Now, the reality is you're going to need to address it both ways, that, on a specific issue, there's some level of having to deal with it. And then, of course, it's an underlying issue that affects really sort of anything. And I'm going to share a quote right now that comes from a Black woman activist in Staten Island. And this was her experience when we actually did wade into race and sort of open up open things up for the first time in an arena where, they'd been doing a lot of work together, community and NGOs, and it really was not something that was, part of the conversation. And this is what she said. And this was a woman, by the way, that in terms of, her work, she was both admired and people found her to be challenging. but here's what she said. The issue of race and racial inequities was included in the conversation, a first for Staten Island. It was honest, emotional, and intense. As we each told our story, we recognized we are more alike than we are different, and we want the same things, an exemplary education for our children. At the core of every sentence was a real commitment to move all children to not just meeting minimum state standards, but exceeding them. For the first time since my children began their academic career, I see glimpses of a beautiful future for marginalized students of color on Staten Island, where leaders who formerly were foes are now working diligently behind the scenes in unison. And, I also raised this as well to say that, I think the hardest work we have to do, the hardest cultural work, and I think often the hardest cultural work has to do with race. It's kind of scary to way into it. It's hard, and you obviously need to do it with thought and thoughtful approaches and with some level of expert support in it. But as much as it can seem scary, it can also just really unlock things in a major way. And so this sort of addressing this up front, in addition to thinking about strategies, and what I just shared with you, one of the things I think is part and parcel to this work is it's not just about sort of coming up with those technical strategies that you saw earlier with the 6 conditions, and it's not just about sort of doing this deeper work. The ideal is to be able to do them together. Now, where we are there is that the work has led to sort of a new level of collaboration between community and schools. It's very much a work in progress, but hopefully you can sort of start to see how they come together as we think about using those 6 conditions in a very real way to think about systems change. What we thought we'd do, I think it was really your request, so I'm really responding to it, but was, go deeper, when you think about cultural change, I think power dynamics does end up being an area that, it's just, goodness. I mean, not a lot of us, some of us do, but not a lot of us have, an incredible amount of experience in terms of addressing power dynamics. And I think we all know how critical and how important they are. So we're going to sort of open up the box there. And I'll say up front that, everything you hear from me today is, my own learning and development on this. And there are many people in the world who are a bit more informed and better able to talk about this particular topic. But hopefully what I have to share with you and offer for you today is helpful. It's also interesting to me that at least it has been my experience, and I wonder if it's your own, that the people who are not in formalized positions of power are very interested in talking about this topic and having a transparent conversation. And those that are in formalized positions of power are much less interested and open to this. So let's leave that there for now as something to come back to as we think about the role that you all play. Now, related to that though, I thought I'd start with a story of my own about power. As somebody who's white and privileged and in a position of authority and influence, at least share one story about that before we move on to others. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, as Carrie said, for almost 20 years, I ran an organization called FSG. It's a nonprofit consulting firm and think tank. And we, over my tenure there, grew to 165 people doing work around the world, and a really amazing group of people, and very grateful and honored for the opportunity that posed. I was really excited about being a great leader. I've always been excited about being a great leader, and I felt we had a great culture at FSG. In it's probably about 2012, 2013. We did a sort of survey of people of color who were working at FSG. And why did we do that? Well, we found that we had not been retaining people of color at the same rate that we, did with other folks. And we had a really, great retention rate there. So we felt like we had to figure it out. And I went into the survey process. My orientation at the time was, we've got an open and participatory, organization, and that's the way I tried to lead it. We were high performing, but we were also nurturing. We were hugely focused on people development. And so that's sort of and that's sort of what was played back to me as well in terms of the culture that we had. When I read through the results from the survey, and it was, again, people of color who were at the organization, what I saw, what I felt was just a tremendous amount of anger and frustration. And it just shocked me. What I heard is the culture doesn't support us. We can't be ourselves. They're not open to hearing from us. And I had to put down the results and go away, and came back and hoped that they changed. But they didn't change. And so that was the start of sort of a process of trying to open things up and do an immense amount of listening, shift, in fact, how where we could, where power was located in the organization. And, through all of that, I did some things right, and I did some things and probably more wrong. This is not easy stuff. What I learned is that even those of us who feel we're positive and benevolent in our use of power have something to learn in terms of what we're missing. Inevitably, we've got blind spots. Every human being has blind spots, but as leaders, we definitely have blind spots. The importance of giving an avenue for voice. Inevitably, if you're open to, sort of renegotiating around power, it's going to be messy, but it also can be liberating. And it certainly was both of those for me. So with that story, we'll jump into power. And I thought I'd start with 3 definitions of power. The first, Martin Luther King. Power is the ability to achieve purpose, whether or not it's good or bad, depends upon the purpose. So the condition of power is inherently neutral. It can be used for good or for bad. Power is the ability to change the rules. My definition is I often say power is all about who gets to decide. Power relations are based in nature, but are socially constructed and therefore changeable. Therefore changeable. Socially constructed and therefore changeable. So we'll come back to that. So we're gonna go next to one of those people who I do think is incredibly articulate on power. His name is Eric Liu. He's in the United States. He's co-founder of Citizen University, and he's a director at Aspen, and he's a leading voice for civics in America. And we're going to show a short clip in a moment. It's going to be in the middle of a talk that Eric's giving. I think it's a 3.5, 4-minute clip. And Eric's going to talk about 3 laws of power. The first is that power compounds. The second is that power justifies itself. And the third is that power is infinite.
What do I even mean by power? Talking about power in DC is sort of like talking about money in Wall Street or New York, or talking about image in Hollywood. It's just a thing that is so ambient and so ever present that people stop naming or describing or really thinking rigorously about what they mean by the word. But I want to say what exactly it is that I mean when I say power in civic life. I mean simply this: a capacity to ensure that others do as you would like them to do. To some people, that is an uncomfortably menacing definition. To some people, that sounds very authoritarian or domineering. But I invite you to actually step back a second and think about it, not even in the context of partisan politics, but just in the context of your relationships. Family, friends, coworkers. All of us all the time are in this swirling ecosystem of power in which we are trying to ensure that others do as we would like them to do. That power, as it plays out in civic life, is on issues of course, public common concern. And the thing about power, even though so much of the word in this house of cards, age, has a negative moral valence, is that power inherently is neither good nor evil. Power just is. It's like fire. And simply because it can be put to ill use does not mean that we are absolved of the responsibility of understanding how it can be put to good use. And so one of the ways in which this book aims to explore the topic of power is to frame it in the first place as a subject upon which we must get literate. we have to learn how to read power, and we have to learn how to write power. And to do that, in talking about power in civic life, I've kind of boiled down the patterns, the ways that power unfolds in our common and political life into three, broadly speaking, three laws. I want to say a word about each of these laws of civic power. The first is this. It's not a surprise to anybody, yet it's worth naming. Power compounds. The rich get richer. The powerful get powerful. People with clout get more clout. Power compounds and it concentrates in ways that turn the game ultimately into a winner-take-all game. Power left to itself yields monopoly. And that is true in economic life. It's true in civic life. It's true in community life. And that dynamic, of course, is true as well of powerlessness, which also compounds. And when you don't have voice, you tend to get less voice. When you are on the margins, you tend to get pushed farther out into the margins. And again, you don't have to think about national politics and presidential politics, just the life of this community. Washington, D.C., this neighborhood in Washington, D.C., a neighborhood in tremendous flux that is full of both opportunity but also tons of displacement, is a story about the way in which power concentrates and compounds. So that's law number one. Law number two is that power justifies itself. In civic life, every kind of narrative, propaganda, ideology, background story or explanation that we might have about why the economy works the way it does, why white people tend to have more wealth than non-white people, why men dominate our institutions and not women. All the explanations that people offer for these states of affairs are ways in which power justifies itself. Power will create narratives and ideologies and just so stories to explain to everyone who lacks power why it is that they rightfully lack that power, and why it is that those who happen to have concentrated and hoarded that power are the rightful holders of that power. This, again, plays out in so many domains of our life. In economics, of course, the ideology of trickle-down economics is the classic instance of a way in which power justifies itself. That those who already have privilege and wealth need to be coddled and taken care of so that you don't kill the goose that lays the golden eggs, right? So that their wealth can ultimately trickle down and leak its way down to the rest of us. That's a story that many people tell, and it's a story that many people, left and right, Democrats and Republicans, have for decades bought into. Well, if you take these first two laws, the ways in which power concentrates and power justifies itself, you can get into a pretty grim situation, right? You get into a situation that you can see, well, certainly around the world right now, if you think about how institutions are collapsing in a place like Venezuela today, where the legislature and now the courts are beginning to yield and concentrate power to a single dictatorial authoritarian leader. You realize that this is one real-time instance of a place where power is concentrating toward a monopoly, winner-take-all kind of system, and it's justifying itself with ideologies and stories about why that has to be so. So if it were just those two laws, we'd be stuck in a pretty grim doom loop. What saves us from that loop, what helps us break out of that loop, is law number 3, which is this: power is infinite. Power is infinite. And I cannot underscore this enough. Power in civic life is not like energy in a physical system where you have a law of conservation of energy and there's only so much in the system, and if you should get more energy, then that must mean that someone else is getting less energy, right? In civic life, the amount of power that the system can hold is infinite. So that if you learn how to give a public speech, if you learn how to organize your neighbors, if you learn how to frame an issue in a way that is compelling to the media, you don't diminish by one whit my ability to give a public speech or to frame an issue or to mobilize my neighbors. All you've done is added to the net amount of power circulating through our ecosystem.
Let me just repeat those laws. Power compounds. It's like, typically, those that have power get more power. Okay, that's the sort of simple explanation of it. Power justifies itself. Power will spend any amount of different ways to explain to you why they are the right ones to be in power. And then power is infinite. And power is infinite is, I think, the sort of, in all of these, Eric's says, it's also it's not positive or negative, but power is it's just the way power works. But you know, so the power is infinite is the opportunity, and it's the opportunity to sort of say, okay, it's not a zero-sum game, which it often is thought of as such. And I think the best, sort of thinkers on power view it in that way. It's not a zero-sum game. It's not like we have to take power away from people, but we do need to figure out ways that those who have been out of power, the marginalized and vulnerable in particular, can have actually participate with power. And that's where the next slide comes in. And if you had, if you did the pre-reading, this comes from that. This is basically, so most of it, not surprisingly, most of the great sort of analysis and understanding around power has been done by community organizers, grassroots folks who are sort of saying, how do we sort of participate in a fuller way? And one of the paradigms is we could juxtapose power over, which is dominance or control over something or someone, with power to, power with, and power within. So power to is basically the individual ability to act. It's the power to make a difference, that no matter who you are and where you sit, you have a power to make a difference. Power with is all about collective action and the ability to act together. It's about sort of building bridges. And power within is getting that sort of, individual or collective sense of self-worth and building capacity to raise aspirations. So again, this is a way that we start to say, okay, if power is infinite, how can we actually sort of tap into that? And I think this is a great framework for doing that. What I wanted to do, the next one is you can shift the slide, there's a lot on here. But basically, this is an organization called JSS Associates, and what they were wanting to do, in the thinking behind this, was that a lot of what they were seeing with NGOs was that they were really excited about how do we shift policy, and the work was aimed at the very visible dimensions of power, that upper left-hand corner, right? Visible, making and enforcing rules. But they were finding that people were sort of less and less really understanding, if you go down the left-hand column, the hidden sources of power and the invisible sources of power. Now, what's interesting, this is interesting on a lot of levels, but what's interesting about this is, if you remember the 6 conditions in the 3 levels, we have that same sort of sense of what's more visible, what's semi-visible, and what's hidden. So we're just taking that sort of frame and putting it on power. So the idea was that we need to think more, again, about what's hidden and what's invisible. And then the idea was to taking, as we think about sort of power with, power to, and power within, there are ways that we can actually transform the power that exists today. And in the middle column, you have examples of that. On the right-hand side, you've got strategies that basically transform power. So we're looking at the top left-hand corner about what's visible. The ways that we can respond to that are lobbying and monitoring, if we're going all the way to the top right-hand corner, public education, et cetera. If we go to the middle left, the left-hand column in the middle, where it says hidden and setting the agenda, certain groups are excluded from decision-making. Often formal institutions with visible power often exercise hidden power. How do we respond to that? You can go all the way to the right and see that through community organizing, through using alternative media outlets, through doing research. And then on the bottom, what's invisible. And this is basically how is power shaping, what's normal, quote unquote normal. We can respond to that if you go to the bottom right-hand corner through sharing stories, speaking out, connecting with others. So there is a lot here. There's sort of a lot to unpack. But, again, coming back to what is this about? It's like giving us a way and undermine sort of, searching out equity, naming the power dynamics that exist, And then second, identifying and developing multiple mix of strategies. So again, it somewhat mirrors what we were talking about for the 6 conditions overall. You want to sort of identify what's going on and then develop strategies. Now we're just going inside of power and identifying what's visible, what's hidden, and what's invisible. And then we're thinking about strategies that can actually transform power and enable more, people to actually be a part of the process.